Why do we long for eternal relationships? Because they are. They are eternal relationships.
Yeah.
And that longing in our heart is met in the Christian worldview. It turns out that if the Christian worldview is true, the longings of our heart have been designed by the Creator God who designed us in His image. And those things you're longing for are actually the evidence. It's that argument from Desire that C.S. Lewis, if I find things that cannot be desires I cannot meet in this world, it's probably because I was not meant for this world.
I believe every single person has a ministry. Ministry isn't just for preachers, and it's not just for pastors. It's the way you shine the light that God gave you through His Spirit in all spaces that He's trusted you to walk. That means you on your college campus. That means you at your corporate job. That means you in high school. That means you with your friends at the bar or the restaurant. That means you wherever you are. You have the responsibility to shine God's light in that space, and you get the chance to. Friend, you are beautiful, you are worthy, and you are made to shine. Everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Made to Shine show. I just can't stop smiling because I'm so excited to be having Jim Wallace on with us back today. Jim, you are, as I said previously, my second repeat guest I've ever had. And just so excited, honored to have you on talking about your new book. We were mentioning before this, like, mission of the show is to remind every single person you have a ministry. Ministry isn't just for preachers and pastors. It's the way you shine your light and shine God's truth in all that you do.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, Annie, because you're absolutely right. And that, for me, this is why this is really, in some ways, looking back at the last 10 years, it came as such a surprise. I was working several cases at the same time when I was also volunteering as a youth pastor. Never thought, well, this is going to be a career. No, I'm not interested in another career. I was coming to the close of this one. And you might think, well, that's kind of a weird way into a Christian sphere. I work in homicides. That's why I think it's a great illustration of I'm nobody. I'm just a guy who worked homicides. And here God has used me to do a few books and to hopefully make a case. And there's seasons for this. And so the question is, well, okay, so I just got done teaching a class at Biola last weekend where we're talking about a bunch of people come in, get their master's in apologetics. Some of them don't. They just audit the class. They want to know, how can I, without anything unusual skill set, like, is there a ministry opportunity for me? Of course, so there's a ministry opportunity even if you don't speak publicly about Jesus. But it turns out that God uses all of these weird experiences that we have, and often He uses our suffering to leverage something beautiful for the kingdom, to turn you into a messenger. Like always, that old expression, right? Your mess helps you to become the messenger that delivers the gospel to somebody else. So I kind of feel like I was really blessed that I had a chance to do this when I didn't expect it. And I don't feel even today like I'm much qualified for it, but you just try to, as my friend Greg Kokel says, you wherever you're planted, you try to grow where you're planted. And that's what I tried to do. Yeah.
And you use what you have. I think about Moses. It's like, God, I can't do this. Well, what do you have? Like, God totally dismisses any of Moses's questions. Just like, what did I give you? And it's true. It's taking autonomy over the light God put in your heart. What do you have? Where are you planted? And how are you growing there? And, it's funny because obviously the truth and true crime, I was telling you before this, I was lucky enough to get a proofread copy and devoured it, just annotations everywhere. But I think what's so funny, I was listening back to our previous conversation, and, the question I always ask people kicking off the show is, what is your favorite quote and why? And you told me it was a C.S. Lewis quote. You said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, but if it's true, it's of the absolute importance. It can't have moderate importance. And it made me think back to just this idea of truth. We live in this world of my truth. And it's like, no, there is the truth, and it's God's truth. And that's what we're called to shine in all spaces. For you, it was this book. And so,
well, and you know how sometimes, Annie, you'll see that people will contextualize this. Everything's about lived experience, right? And I always wondered, at what point would we have a hard time in jury selection? In other words, so I get it. We all have our own experience. But when it comes down to, did so-and-so kill so-and-so, or did that series of events occur the way that the evidence points? And is that your truth? Is our jury going to be divided by people who say, well, for me, it didn't really happen that way? Well, I guess the point is, I think this is one of the last places in America right now, it seems like, where we're asking the question, can we determine what objectively occurred in the past with enough certainty to render a verdict? And in that setting so far, I have not, like, we can talk a lot about subjective truth claims, but it turns out that in that setting, for the most part, it's still, now look, do we see all the time in the news, all the time, that people arrive at wrong verdicts? Of course we do. And a lot of that, though, is has the prosecution presented it in a certain way where it doesn't give the jury much choice. But I still think that we cannot lose the idea that what we're trying to figure out, and this book tries to figure this out, is there a certain approach we might take to life that, regardless of your current circumstance, and I think that's what there's 15 crime stories in this book, and there's 15 rules for life in this book that you learn from working deaths, you learn from working murders. Now, what's interesting about them is I don't think any of them are dependent on culture or place in history. In other words, I think that these rules for life are really driven by our biology, by our biochemistry, in other words, by the way we have been created by God. And so that's why they span the centuries. That's why the advice that someone can give you in the first century, you're thinking, well, yeah, we're not in the first century anymore. Well, to be honest, all the current studies still show that piece of advice that was very ancient, that is revealed in a true crime story, that piece of advice still applies to us. Well, why would that be? That we're not in the area around Jerusalem. We're not in the first century. We're not in that culture. Well, because it's driven by our biochemistry. It's not an issue of culture or context. It's like, we were created. I mean, this was true for Adam. It's true for us. These principles have transcended time.
Yeah, and what's so powerful, as I was reading, I was like, I was talking to a friend who's not a believer, and I was reading with this before we were meeting for coffee, and she's like, what are you reading? And I was explaining it to her, and she's like, oh, I might read that just because I love that kind of stuff. I'm like, really? Which was so cool for me because, again, she's not a believer, but she loves true crime. She listens to all the true crime podcasts. So I'm curious for you, so the listeners have some context. This book, you even mentioned before this, it's not normally what you've written about in the past. So talk to me about the why now behind this book, and also this natural fascination people have with crime, with figuring out truth behind why this happened, why this is such a big thing in our culture.
Well, I've been wanting to write the book forever. I started off writing kind of more strict Christian evidential apologetics books because that was the stuff I was teaching my youth group. And Sean McDowell, the apologist, was with me on one of these trips. And he was the one who said, hey, you should write a book about that. And so that became Cold Case Christianity. And I almost look back and I go, I wish I would have written this book first because it might have started me in an entirely different direction. But I think there is a season for writing books. And this is the kind of book you write when you're an old man. You write these kinds of books as you get older because now you kind of had some perspective on and it gets richer. So in other words, if I'm writing about if young people who are listening to this now, one thing I can guarantee you, if you haven't suffered yet, you will. In other words, you're going to experience something that you will consider to be traumatic. And it might be something simple, like you didn't get the job, or you break up with somebody you thought you might marry, or it could be any number of things. But as you get older, you have more time to experience the stuff that we typically call trauma or typically call suffering. Well, it turns out I didn't have a lot to say about that in my 30s and my 40s because I really hadn't experienced enough, and I hadn't been around enough people. And even working murders, you see it from the same kind of a limited context. Well, now in my 60s, I'm able to say, you know what? If I could go back and do this over again in my 20s, here's what I wish I would have known then. And I wasn't even a Christian until I was 35. So I wouldn't have known any of this stuff from Scripture. So I think that's why this book is being written for me now. I think I'm in the best place to write it. But I'll just tell you, I've been trying to convince a publisher to write this book for many, many years. And it was just once they see you in this one way. I was talking to my friend Lee Strobel, who's written The Case for Christ. And everyone knows Lee as the guy who writes the case books, right? The case for this, and the case for, a case for God's existence, a case for, for Creator, all the stuff he's written. And he stepped out and he wrote a fiction book. And he found that it was hard to make a transition. People couldn't stop seeing him the way they saw him and all those other things he had written. That's what they expect from him. They don't want anything else from him. Well, that's probably true. A lot of what, that's what happens when you get in publishing, is that people kind of say, well, you don't want to be too eclectic, because then we can't figure out who you are. So this book is very different for me. And I think the reason why people are interested in true crime is kind of the reason why I wrote the book. A lot of us just like to puzzle. We want to, solve the mystery. I often say when I do Dateline episodes, it's not like we don't know how this turned out before we start doing the interviews, because we clearly do. I mean, the thing's been adjudicated. We know who the bad guy is, but when we do the Dateline episode, they're going to want a rabbit trail for a few segments to get the audience to think, oh, maybe it's this guy over here. And then at the last minute, they'll pull it out and say, here's who it really was. Well, okay, what are we doing? We're encouraging the audience and we feed them little clues along the way. You remember back there and he said this? Well, it turned out it meant that. Okay, well, what are we doing? We're kind of scratching the itch that a lot of people have. Because if you think about it, mystery is a huge genre. People love, there's romance movies, there's rom-coms, there's comedies, and there's an entire big block of movies that are made that are mysteries. And a subset of mysteries is true crime. Now, here's what's more interesting. Women are the dominant fans of true crime, and far more than men. Yeah, it's statistically far more than men. Well, you experienced though anecdotally, right, with your friend when you're sitting there saying, "Oh, yeah, this is a book I would read." Well, you saw this like Oxygen Channel. I think it was mostly the programming in Oxygen flipped over to true crime, and it was a good example of, okay, this is what's happening. Now, I read one time, I was just kind of searching around myself thinking, has anybody else written about this? And there's a female columnist who wrote about it. And she said that it was her belief, and I think it's probably true, that for a lot of women who are in the fans of this genre, a lot of it is because each one of these is a cautionary tale. It's like, hey, am I doing that? Is that happening? Is that similar? Like we're kind of watching this stuff and asking ourselves, could that happen to me? And because dominantly the suspects in these cases are men, and often the victims are women, that these do become a genre that women are more interested. I think it's about learning. Are men really that crazy? Like men, we already know we're that crazy. So do we really want to watch it? But for women, I think you're discovering how crazy we really are. And I'll just tell you, what I've seen is some of the stuff I've seen is unbelievable. And you think, and that's one of the chapters in this book. Is that normal? Are we all that lost? Are we all that depraved?
Well, that's what I was curious about. Because I think when, like, as a woman, I am so skittish. And if I watch like Criminal Minds, I can't sleep for 3 weeks. So I stay away from movies about murders. I'm your classic Hallmark girl. But people I know, naturally, when you read stuff like this, you tend to see yourself as the victim. Like you see as like the cautionary tales. You look at yourself naturally as, oh, I could potentially be the victim. You very rarely ever see yourself as the person that's inflicting the pain and inflicting. But I think that's the other side of that, which reading your book was so interesting, just the relationship about human nature and what we're capable of. And so I'm curious for you, like throughout the lessons, everything you writing about in your book, like talk to me about what you've learned in life through what we're capable of as humans. And the other side of that I'm interested in is because I think as Christians specifically, we get really good at stack ranking sin. Like, I'm not sinning as bad as them. Oh, I'm not a murderer. Oh, I might gossip or lie, but I would never do that. And like the importance of recognizing what our human nature, what we're capable of, because we all need the blood of Jesus. And so talk to me about some of your revelations with that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that this book tries to do. I mean, like Jordan Peterson, he wrote a book, I think it was 12 Rules for Life. I think it was what it's called. I'm not sure, but I didn't read it because I didn't want to know what he thought 12 best. I don't even He came to a different way. I came to
Mm-hmm.
these. This is just what I've seen working criminal cases. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you that I do think you're right. There's a sense in which I wanted to know, is this something we're all capable of? So one of the chapters in this book is really just focused on that issue, and it's called The Killer Inside. And the reason why it really started with me, probably right around 2000 when I was working a case, maybe in the late 90s. I was working a case where the guy that was a primary suspect, I described this case. Remember, all my cases I cloak just slightly. I hope I've cloaked them enough so that victims' families aren't feeling like I'm exposing their secrets. And I always say that in the first chapter of my books. But this particular case, and you'll see in the book, was somebody who was so well respected. And that's always the case when you're working cold cases. Like, by the time you get to this guy, he's been out there for 30 years and no one suspected him of doing a murder 30 years ago. As a matter of fact, he got away with it, and then he lived an exemplary life. And then, so by the time we could take him to jail, everyone's like I've had one case, for example, where the victim was his wife, and when we finally arrested him, nobody was happy. So, of course, his kids did not think he had killed their mom. His family did not think he was capable of killing his wife. And her family said, there's no way. We love this guy like a son. Wow. He's our beloved son now. There's no way he killed our daughter. Like, nobody wants to believe it. Why? Because his nature was such behind the murder that he was the same sweet, gentle teddy bear he was before the murder. And then the question becomes, well, okay, so is he just is he a psychopathic? What's the deal here? Yeah. Well, no, it turns out he's just like everybody else. He's just like all of us. That we have what's known as the enigma of man, that we are capable of great altruism, and the studies show this. We're also capable of great evil and harm, and the studies show that. So how could this be that we're so duplicit? Well, if you look at the altruistic side of the coin, you'll find that if you drill down on the studies, and I try to do this in the book, and I've tried to give you a ton of research in the book, and this,
you do,
by the way,
and it's very absorbable. So
okay, good. And really that end note section is the shortened version. The blown out one's about 250 pages, and I offer that online. But I wanted you to at least see like where I'm getting the data from. So there's stuff that shows that even on the altruistic side, the studies show that we're altruistic as long as there's enough resources so that we can take care of ourselves first. So hey, we're generous until, of course, there's, a limited supply. And then we're hoarding because like we did in the pandemic, because we are going to serve ourselves first. So I just wanted to know, because this is what I think people are being told. And maybe you see this also. And look, we are generationally different. That's why I was really looking forward to this show, because I want to pick your mind a little bit about a few things. But what I see is that the culture is kind of saying, no, people are generally, if you're a secular humanist, it's because you rate humans pretty highly and you think pretty highly of them, that they are basically innately good and pure and innocent, and they are corrupted by their families or bad situations, maybe their environment, their context of history, maybe even a corrupt political system. So if you can replace the systems and the environments, people would come out a lot better. The other view is that, no, actually, we're so deeply broken and fallen that we are the corruptors of families, the corruptors of organizations, the corruptors of systems. So you can create a new system and you can bring it into place. We'll find a way to mess that one up too, because that's who we are. Well, if knowing which of these two is true is helpful, because at least it gives you a proper perspective of who we are. But here's why it's even more helpful. If you start to realize, and this is, I wish I would have put this in the book this way, but I didn't, that when you're sitting at the table interviewing somebody who's been accused of a murder, it's really easy to think of yourselves as two kinds of people in that room. A good person and a bad person. And a good person sitting on one side of the table and a bad person sitting on the other. But once you realize that that guy sitting across the table from you is you, and you are him, we're no different. We are each deeply fallen. And but for the grace of God, my buttons weren't pushed the way this guy, his buttons were pushed. He did one murder, only one. He didn't do another one. Spent the next 30 years living great. Nobody can believe he even did that 30 years ago. But something pushed him to that point 30 years ago. And I have no idea what set of circumstances got him there. But let me tell you, it could have been me, could have been you, could have been everyone. Every one of us is capable of doing this kind of murder. And that's just the flat truth of it. And that helped me, number one, to realize that, yeah, don't let somebody who has a surprisingly good looking life fool you into thinking they were never capable of this. That's number one. Number two, don't think you can separate from people because you think you're something better than they are, because you're not. And it changed the way that I offered grace to the people who I previously thought of as bad people.
That's
right.
So
and it turns out they're not bad people. They're just people. And Luther wrote at one point that his view was that we are so deeply self-absorbed and self-focused that even when we do something that might be considered moral or virtuous, or something that might be something that God would honor, we're doing it for all the wrong reasons. It's all about, we're trying to earn something. It's a transaction we're trying to have with God. We're trying to earn the respect of our peers, even maybe just feel good about ourselves. We're not doing it for the right reasons. And I got to ask the question, is it even possible for us? And that's why
what I was going to ask, because you talk about in the book, like humility being the key to human flourishing. Well, it's like, what is truly humble? Are we able to get there with our broken, self-absorbed selves? Because I'm thinking about, in my mind, the most humble things I've ever done, there was a component of, I wanted to feel like a good person. I wanted to receive that person's happiness that I was doing that for.
Absolutely.
What does that look like?
So that's my whole point. So this is why so this is a different chapter of the book, but we talk about a guy who was like a local street legend in our city based on how he had evaded the police, had never been arrested for anything really bad that he'd ever done. He was a street gangster. He was slinging dope. He was very powerful, connected to a family in the state prison system, and heavily tattooed to the point where I at that time had never seen anyone like that. So he was kind of like a living legend amongst his peers and even amongst the gang officers who worked that area. So I meet this guy, and it turns out his street celebrity is what ended up getting him killed. And it started me thinking about, wow, why do we what? I didn't have anything to compare it to at the time, but if you read scripture, we're called to have quiet, peaceable lives. Like, we're not supposed to be seeking. There's nothing good that comes from celebrity. And you and I are right in the bullseye of that. This thing we're doing online is kind of a generational leveler. So I could look and say, well, I'm this many years older than Annie, so I'm in a different generation. But if we look at generations and measure them by our behaviors, because usually used to be that my grandmother, she went to work a different way. She went to the market a different way. I mean, I've got a great grandmother who drove a horse and wagon so we were behaving differently. But if you look at my mom, who's 84, she's on her social media the same way that we are at 62, and you. So we've got several generations here that now behave the same way. It's a leveler, okay? So if you think about it, how we see ourselves, I think we have to ask these questions about, was it true? If it's true in my generation, is it also true in yours? And this celebrity thing is now available to all of us because there are no gatekeepers. Annie, when I was at your age, the only way you could become as well known as you are now would have been if you were on a TV show on legacy media, and you'd probably need to be on the TV show like between the 8 and 10 o'clock hour. That was called prime time, right? After 10 o'clock, not as many people were watching. And you only had 3 channels, ABC, NBC, CBS. No one's watching those channels much anymore. Now we're all watching streaming platforms, but there's thousands of shows to choose from. So the audiences are much smaller. But now there's no gatekeepers. So you could actually become an influencer without the approval of any producer at CBS, NBC, or ABC. You become your own producer. You now are the gatekeeper. Yeah. And what that did is it opened up the possibility of celebrity to all of us. And celebrity is the exact opposite of humility. Now, that is the secret sauce. That chapter on humility, and I've been saying this everywhere I can go, that turns out to be the secret sauce for a great life. That if you look at all the data in secular studies, all of this data says that if you can simply embrace humility at any age, you will have, number one, better grades, higher income, deeper relationships with your boyfriend or girlfriend, deeper commitment to your spouse. You'll be a better employee, a better employer once you become one. You'll have better physical health, better longevity, better mental health. Every way that we measure human flourishing it turns out humility is the key to success. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think many secular people even know that. And when I often would kind of pose it that way, I would say, what do you think it is that would increase all these dimensions? And they'll say things like, I don't know, exercise or meditation. Or no, it's humility. We've moved so far from it in a culture that's all about celebrating platform. Celebrate. That's what we do. Yeah. We celebrate platform. Okay, now I say all that because of every worldview, you made a good point that's what triggered my thinking in this. It turns out that of all the worldviews, only one promotes humility. Because think about it, if you're in a secular humanist worldview or just a non-religious worldview, you believe that, hey, I'm going to do certain things. I'm going to earn a degree to get a certain result. I'm going to do this to earn a certain favor of my boss. It's meritorious. I'm going to do something and expecting a transaction back that I'm going to receive something. And anytime your worldview is built on doing, pride is going to rise. Yeah. Because at some point you're like, hey, I'm good at this. I've been doing this really well. And you're going to compare yourself to the next person. And if that person gets promoted over you and you think he didn't work as hard as you did, or she didn't work as hard as you did, now you're going, that's not right. I got passed over. Why we call it passed over? Because you think somebody else did it with less work, didn't earn it. See, this is the problem with any worldview that involves earning of any way. Now, it turns out all the other theistic and spiritual worldviews are do worldviews. You got to do these Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold, whatever it may be. You got to do the Karma Yoga. You got to, whatever it may be, you have to do it to receive the highest offering of that worldview. Only one says, no, you know what? You can't do anything. You're that broken. As a matter of fact, if we don't offer this to you for nothing, if it's not a free gift, ain't no one going there, because there's nobody here who does anything for anything other than selfish reasons. Even like when you said, yeah, I'm doing this nice thing, but I'm thinking, oh, I look better. I feel better. I just feel like I'm a better person when I do it. Again, it's self-absorption. So you'd have to have a worldview that says, no, not about doing it. It's done. It's done. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to give it to you as a free gift so that no one can boast, Paul says.
Yeah.
I'm taking the pride thing out. Now that could be a coincidence that there's one worldview that leverages the one thing that leads to the highest levels of human flourishing, or it could actually be an evidence that this is a worldview that comes from the mind of your designer, who knows what is best for you. Yeah. And has offered you the only way. So here's what I would say, going back to that table where I'm sitting in that room. I got the bad guy on one side, and I should have wrote this way in the book, but this is what I'm telling people now. The world is not divided between people who are good and bad, right or wrong. The world is utterly divided between the proud and the humble. And it's as simple as that. It's not divided between those who believe and don't believe, because it turns out pride is often what's keeping us. It's divided between the proud and the humble. And this view that God exists and you're not him, that he's got a way that may not feel like it's normal to you because it's holy. And so I think that this is the view that opens the door to everything. Now you can't chase it. You cannot pursue humility because you'll get proud doing it. Instead,
that's really my question.
Okay.
Was like, how do you walk? What are the trail markers that you know you're being humble? Because I think about my go-getters out there that are like, yes, I'm with you. I'm going to be so humble. I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm going to do it, Annie. And it's like, no, you don't do it. So tell me about, how do you receive it?
Okay, so I would say this. First of all, there's not a single chapter in this book I'm good at. I stink at all of them. So when I wrote this book, I knew that this is not something I could say, well, I'm an expert in this, any of these chapters, and they're all different attributes of human flourishing. But I know that these are targets we should be aiming at. And so if you don't aim at anything, you hit it every time. So you have to be focused on what it is you think is worth pursuing. Even if you think, I'm not good at this, I'm never going to be good at this, I don't know if I can ever be good at this. Okay, I get it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't at least still see its importance. Now, because I know that you cannot pursue humility, let me tell you what it is. It is a realization. It's an assessment. Spurgeon said it's a proper assessment of who we are. So the one thing that helps me is, if you were thinking about this theologically and you said, how do I think of God? Well, of all the attributes of God's nature that you could focus on, because you could focus on a lot, right? Yeah. He's omnipotent. He's got all the power. He is omnibenevolent. He's all love. He's omniscient. He knows everything. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere at all times. Those things probably will not help you to surrender your pride. So the one thing you could focus on, and you'd have to really be aware of it and look for it in every chapter you read in Scripture, focus on God's holiness. If you focus on God's holiness, he's so set apart and unique in his perfection, that then you'll start to see that, why did I think any of the stuff I've been doing really was all that great? I mean, I got to compare myself not to you or to the person sitting next to me in church or to my spouse or to my kids. I have to compare myself to a holy God. Isaiah, in the first chapters of Isaiah, it's all about Isaiah until he stands in front of a holy God. Then it's all about God, because he realizes that, he just knows immediate submission. Whatever I thought of myself, that is not true, because now I see what the standard is. And this gold standard, I'm nowhere close to it. You might think you're a generous person because you've been tipping, your drivers, $5. You've been tipping the guy at the car wash $5. Well, if you're who's the richest man in the world today, whoever that is, if he did something for you and you tipped him $5, you'd feel like a fool. Mm-hmm. You would suddenly realize that this is much. And it's because you now realize who this guy is. Well, okay, same thing's happening here. And I think this focus, this self-assessment, and this focus on the holiness of God is at least an important first step. The second thing I would say is, it's an old statement made years ago, but I'm not sure who first said it, but it's easier to act your way into feelings than to feel your way into actions. Mm-hmm. So even if you thought, like, I need to be a more humble person, well, one thing you can do is to stop celebrating yourself and to start celebrating others. Mm-hmm. And that's an act that is just a quick maneuver that if you do that, if in every situation, you might know this, you'll see sometimes that football players will do this. And if you're somebody who ever pays attention to those press conferences, a really good leader, when they win, will say, oh man, it's all my teammates. This so-and-so did a great job. They'll deflect it. They'll deflect the congratulations toward their teammates. Now, when they lose, they'll say, yeah, it was all on me. I need to prepare better. So you take the blame, you give the credit. And that, I think, and look, do you really probably feel that way when you're on the stand, when you're on the podium talking to the press? You probably in your mind are thinking, I threw the ball right to him. He just flat out dropped it. Yeah. Hit him in the hands, for crying out loud. Well, you're not going to say that. Practice just make a practice of celebrating and as Paul says that this is the thing about humility. C.S. Lewis basically puts it this way. He says that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Yeah. But that's not actually what's in Scripture, though. Paul says that we're to think of others as greater than ourselves. Mm. So it's both. It's thinking less of yourself and thinking of yourself less. It's both. It's a both and, not a neither or. And I think that means that Paul's saying, you're not inclined to do that. I wouldn't have to tell you this if you did it naturally. I'm telling you this because you don't do it. And it turns out that you're not going to be transformed by the renewing of your habits. It helps. Or the renewing of your relationships, or the renewing of your emotions. You're transformed, according to Paul in Romans 12, or the renewing of your mind. So we have to so the first step, I think, is a proper assessment, right? Yeah. And then pushing ourselves through the practices that help remind us that we are not that special. Yeah. And I'll tell you what it does. In Mother Teresa, I quoted Mother Teresa in this book because it protects you. Because if you're not anywhere as good as anyone says you are, and you're not anywhere near as bad as anyone claims you are, you are just another broken human that God loves, that God will redeem for free because he loves you that much. That's been helpful for me to realize now I'm bulletproof. I don't have to worry about what people say about me because I know that it's not their opinion that matters anyway.
And I think that's so powerful because a lot of times that's stuff that we hear and we know, but we don't absorb it. And I think the gap between hearing and absorption is because we think it's not really in our favor. It's like we think that in order for God to be big, we have to say we suck and make ourselves really small. But it's like, God isn't a middle school girl that needs you to put yourself down to make him bigger. He's God. It's just as you said, it's when you recognize how big he is, that's when you understand how small you are, not because you're making yourself smaller, but just because by nature you're smaller. And our nature, like you said, we have good and evil in us. So back to your point about humility being the key to human flourishing, when you have the humility to know you have that in you, and you with the power of the Holy Spirit, and you don't have to opt into those sinful natures because you do have the Spirit in you, like that's when you can flourish, because you're humble enough to submit to a God that gives you the power to choose against your harmful, negative, harmful, like I said, nature.
Well, let me add to that. It's even better than that too, I think, because look, I know I'm still in rebellion so often.
Yeah.
Every day I'm in rebellion. So I often will say things like, I know that he's in control. And I know that I ought to, in 5 minutes, in 5 minutes, I'll surrender to that. But right now, I'll be in 5 minutes. Well, I think it's probably a lot of us that are resisting, and we know we shouldn't do that. We're almost like negotiating with the Holy Spirit, tug of warring inside of us. But here's the great thing, is that God's grace is so big. We're studying through, I think it's 2 Kings. There's a passage in 2 Kings about how David is. And so last night, Susie and I were studying this about how David was bringing the ark back to Israel. And that's that passage where they're carrying the ark and it slips, and somebody and by the way, they broke every rule they're supposed to have and how they're supposed to transport the ark. So they're breaking all these rules on how they're supposed to transport it. And then it starts to slip off. And somebody, one of the characters in the book, in the story, touches the side of the ark to kind of keep it on his rack. And he's instantly killed by God. And he's already, not supposed to touch that. Not supposed to carry it that way. Not supposed to even transport it. You've broken every rule. And so there's a sense in which God's holiness is actually scarier than we think. Like, there's way scarier than we think. And then what happens next is they give the ark, because David's like, let's give it to this foreigner and have him put it in his house for a while. So they give it to this guy who's not an Israelite, and he puts it in his house. And God ends up blessing this guy for the entire time that it was being stored in his house. And so now David sees that, God is way holier than I think he is, scary holier, but he's also way more gracious than I thought he was. You see in the way he reacts with both of these different people. And there we have that. There's a chapter in this book about God's justice and God's mercy, God's truth and grace, and how these are aspects of our own character that we get from God, and how if we can hold these in fullness, we always flourish better. But we never do. So how do we hold those two things? And that's a great passage that shows that if I can just look at that and go, probably for every minute that I'm scared by the fact, frightened by a God who is so holy, that kind of thing would be that offensive. I could be just blown away by his grace, that he would actually suffer the kind of stupid stuff that I'm doing every day, yet still use me in some way. And his grace extends even to us. That's why this idea that everyone's got a mission is so. I think that we kind of know that, but we're not executing it. So I hope that people who are listening to you today and who have been listening to this podcast realize that, we can talk about it, but you don't grow until you step out and start doing stuff where you fail sometimes, where you just wonder what it is God's going to do with you. You have to be motivated enough to go do something.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid of the fact that, I'm going to go out into a world full of other apologists who are way more trained than me, other theologians who know way more, have been much better. I'm not even educated in that way. So just know that I'm going to be criticized. Don't be afraid. Don't you be afraid. You got to letting you experience certain things. Start writing about them. So look what you did. You started this platform where you started, everyone who's listening, you at least have social media. You at least have a Facebook page where you can start to proclaim the grace and goodness of God. And God will start using that. So if you don't have a website of your own, someday maybe you will. But for now, you have a page. Go write something today.
Start somewhere. And even just the way you live your life, going to class, I mean, that's the whole point of this podcast. But I think too, someone once said this in a sermon, but if Paul had social media, I look at it like a tool. It's like a hammer. A hammer can build a house. It can stub a toe. It's how you use it. Paul could have blasted out so many messages all over the world from one location. I think he would have been like, what? You guys have this capability and you're not using it in this cool way. But to your point, I think what's so powerful too is fear of the Lord. I will say, I love that. And I think COVID had a lot to do with this, bringing church to our homes. It created, especially with this generation, I feel like so many people I talk to, they believe in such a personal God. They know God is their ultimate friend. He's their father. But I think we've missed this component of fearing the Lord. Like the Lord is the Lord over your life. He is God. He's the Alpha and the Omega. Like he created the heavens and the earth. I think I can speak from a personal testimony for myself, like recently going through Revelations, my pastor's talking about how the Jesus that was the friend walking with the disciples and the Jesus that's reigning on the throne now, those are two different, I mean, it's the same Jesus, but he is God in all his glory right now. And I think we've missed this component of the fear of the Lord. And that goes to kind of the compulsion we have to worship things. I think there's so many, you talk about this in your book, like the correlation between worship and behavior. And I think about idolatry in our world today. And we have so many idols. And I want to talk about that because I think this lack of fearing the Lord and his holiness contributes to our need to worship idols elsewhere. And so I'm curious for you, what do you see are the biggest sources of idolatry today? Because I think sometimes people think of it as Baal in the Old Testament, but there's idols today. And where do you think, how do people really start to understand and absorb this fear of the Lord that needs to aid to their faith and worship in God?
Yeah, no, I don't think I ever really saw while I was working these cases, thought of it strictly as idolatry. But now that I look back at it, every crime really is an act of idolatry. It's driven by idolatry because what happens is we get hung up on three things that cause every murder: sex, money, and power. Sex, money, and power. It's the same three things. What about jealousy? What are you jealous about? It's probably something to do with sex, money, or power. What about vengeance? What are you feeling vengeful about? It's something to do with sex, money, or power. There's no fourth category. And I'd say the lion's share of stupid criminal behavior is coming out of the power section. It's when we think we matter more than others. We want the control. We want the autonomy. I'm going to steal from my parents because I am feeding my drug habit. It's about my enjoyment, my pleasure, not theirs. Don't care. I'm better than that. I'm killing people of a different race. What is that? I'm in control. I matter more than you. That whole I matter more than you, that falls in that power category. Celebrity falls in the power category also. So what happens is typically, and there's a story in this book about a guy who was killed for almost nothing, for no good reason at all. And he didn't really offer anything in those three categories. So he seemed to defy all of the descriptions I just offered. In other words, this guy was somebody who was part of our homeless community, and he was just canning in alleys and recycling the stuff in the afternoons and buying one meal and drinking the rest of the night and start over again tomorrow. And he was sleeping on the street. The night he was killed, he was sleeping in a porta potty. And he was killed. It's going to be sex, money, and power. That's all that anyone kills for. So I knew that. But I'm like, what's in it for anybody? What's this guy offering in terms of, he's got nothing to offer in those three categories, it seemed to me. So I wasn't quite sure what to make of him. But it turns out that, he had accidentally slipped over into or maybe intentionally, I don't know. He had slipped over into an alleyway that somebody else had been canning for a while. They consider it to be their territory. And when that guy confronted my victim at a recycling center, the victim just kind of blew him off because he was much older than the kid who was angry about this. He just kind of dismissed it in front of other people in that community that were also canning. And that was enough. And how much are we talking about here? A couple $1, $1.50 maybe, that he might have taken out of trash cans in this guy's alley? $1? I don't even know what it would have been worth. And how much disrespect is he really? He's not like, there wasn't like today when you have disrespect on social media. This is happening in front of a few people at a recycling center. But because when we stop short of worshiping the Creator and we begin to worship as idols the stuff the Creator has created, and that's always going to fall in the categories of sex, money, and power. It's our stuff. It's our relationships. It's our position. It's what we've achieved. It's always going to be in this sex. It turns out if you stop short of worshiping the author of those things, by the way, sex, money, and power, God has given us for our pleasure and for his glory. We just pervert it. We just twist it because we make it an idol. And what happens here is that once you make one of those three things an idol, well, then idols master you. Whatever you worship, that masters you. You're willing to give your time, to give your day, to give your money, to give your thought life. You're willing to give everything to it. And then the slightest little scratch on that new car, that car of your idol, okay, the slightest little scratch on your idol, and you're willing to kill for it because it's so overly important. So for $1 and the way he was treated at a recycling center, this guy was willing to stab this old man to death because it's misplaced worship. That's what it is. Now, the question is, how do you in that chapter, I try to provide you with, I think, 12 questions that you could ask to see what your idols are. And here's what I would say. Like, you and I think that we want people to hear what you have to. Nobody does a podcast they want no one to listen to. Actually, you want, and if you had 100 listeners to this podcast, okay, if you had 100,000, you'd be happier. It turns out that we have our idols because these things matter to us in an extraordinary way. I often offer this thought experiment. If all of us who are public content creators had no way to either know or display how popular the work was, in other words, no social media platform displays how many followers you have, and they don't tell you either. If that's the way every social media platform worked, so you'd never know if the person you're listening to is got an audience of 1 million or an audience of 3. I wonder how long most of us would even do it. To me, I think we do it because that's really the tail that's wagging the dog, and that's in the power category. Now, I know that I have been in seasons where, you can see how many books you're selling. You could measure it, like pastors measure it. How many people are attending? How many baptisms do we have this year? Yeah. How much have we raised in terms of income? We measure to see how we're doing. And there's the danger. Because I'm just telling you, the suspicious man in me who knows my own heart, maybe I'm just projecting this on others, it knows that has become, that has in the past been way too important to me. I had to actually find a way to let go of all of it. So when you write a book, no one writes a book they want no one to read. But I have a partnership with Zondervan. At this point in my life, I just feel like I don't want to let Zondervan down. But to be honest, if I'm going to take the advice I've written about in this book, I'm going to have to let go of all of this and find my identity. There's a chapter on identity in this book in something that's bigger than my achievements. And that's really hard for most of us because we would first say, I'm so-and-so, the host of this. I'm so-and-so. We mention it quickly. And you can tell where your idols are. They're in my bio. They're in my monikers. They're in the stuff on social media that I've chosen to list in that order. And I know better. I actually thought about changing all that, but I thought, no, I'm going to leave it there as so I can talk about it when I do these interviews. So you can see. And if I changed it, it would probably be for false reasons because I want you to think I'm something other than what I really am. No, I'm saying I'm that guy, like all of us, who's struggling with his identity and does not want to let go of the things that don't matter. And they don't matter for human flourishing, I can tell you that. They will not make you, I don't know if you know at my age, I very seldom will, I won't micro listen to the news, right? Like I'm not going to be following public events on an hour by hour basis because I discovered it doesn't make me a better husband. Yeah. And it doesn't make me a better grandfather. It makes me worse. And so I think that we have to, if we're going to take our own advice, we're going to have to reassess everything that we're actually doing right now. Yeah. Because we're doing it with our eyes on achievement and we've let it become part of our identity. And so we do have an idol. And if you have that idol, it'll eventually control you.
Yeah. It's like, it's the thing that has you versus you having it. And I once heard it put like idols are basically taking good things and making it the ultimate thing. Just as you said, it's like when you worship the gift versus the giver of the gift, that's when the gift becomes an idol, which eventually leads you into like self-consumption and destruction. And again, this is for our, like, to worship God, God tells us to do that, not because he needs his ego boosted, but because he's our lifeline. Like you plug your iPhone into the wall because it needs battery. Like God is our battery. He knows that. And when we're plugged into all these other things, we're losing our lifeline. And I think what's so powerful about what you said too is two things. One, that's an everyday intention because we are constantly tempted. We are constantly like that's our human nature. We every day have to be cognizant of what are we worshiping and what's my intent behind something. That's something, oh my gosh, I'm going to struggle with to the day I'll die. Just being someone who loves to achieve. It's like, am I doing this because of what I want the outcome to be or because I think I'm actually required to be obedient here for something?
Yeah, I think the more I focused on these, Annie, the more that helped with the humility component. Because if you look at, I look at these 15 things and I'm like, okay, well, I'm not doing these things very well at all. But I do think we have to aim at something. So I don't want people to get discouraged. And I think there's some beauty in these simple 15 things that I wish I would have known, the younger version of me would have known. Because if I would have known, I would have done a whole number of things differently. Just a whole number of things. And that's one of the things that you'd like to be able to, let's just end this way, because I think this is really what my conclusion on it.
Let's do it.
My wife will often say, she said the other day we were running and she was talking about how, do we want to go back to Germany where she was born? And really it's no, because you can't go back. And all your family members get older, they die. And then the place is like almost sad because the people you love aren't there anymore. You're just visiting where they used to live. And so I realized, you know what? We don't want to go back. We want to go back in time. Like we wish that the relationships we had were eternal relationships. We long for that. And every time we think about, well, you can't go back. It's because you can't go back. Those people are gone. And why do we long for eternal relationships? Because they are. They are eternal relationships. And that longing in our heart is met in the Christian worldview. It turns out that if the Christian worldview is true, my grandfather, who I can't go back and see, I get sad going to his house. But I will be in his presence. He's the Warner that I used in my own name because he was that important to me. So it turns out that everything in this book is stuff you learn in true crimes that studies confirm, but they're the longings of our heart because we have been designed by the Creator God who designed us in his image. And those things you're longing for are actually the evidence. Is that argument from Desire that C.S. Lewis, if I find things that cannot be desires I cannot meet in this world, it's probably because I was not meant for this world. I was designed for another world where our desires are met. And a lot of that is what we talk about in this book. And so I hope that, and that gives me great hope, because a lot of the things that you limit as you get older, you realize, okay, I'm not really getting old. I'm about to start something new. It's not that I'm about to end something. I don't want to finish well. No, I want to prepare well for what I'm about to start. It's a very different way of looking at life. So I hope this is a book that's really full of hope.
It is. And I think what's so cool too is that people you're speaking to, we are so young. We have such an opportunity now to prepare. And that's what's so powerful. Going back to the beginning of this podcast, we all have this insatiable curiosity about what's next. We do, whether you believe in Jesus or what or not, like we all want to know what's next, whether it's in a movie or a book or a crime case or a podcast. And that's from God to get us to go towards him. And this book reminds people of the truth, these life truths that we have the power at 19, 20, 25, 26 years old to start now and not wait 30 years. So thank you for taking the time to write this. I think this book, like I read it, I was like, the main audience should be my age group because we are the ones that need to absorb this and put this into our life now, today. Not yesterday. It's like the quote I love. It's like, what's the best time to plant a tree? Well, 400 years ago. The next best time is today. And there's so many people my age.
Good point.
Like, we can plant it today. And so just thank you for taking the time to write this. Where can people find you? I know you've got a hard stop soon, but where can people find you and get the book?
You can find me at coldcasechristianity.com for the kind of daily stuff we do. But this book we've positioned at thetruthandtruecrime.com because we want to offer people a way to go deeper in their commitment to what is true about Christianity. So we're offering our Casemakers course there for anyone who buys the book because we really think that we want, it's a 10.5 hour, 30 session course that if you really want to know, why is this true? Why does it matter? in a world that doesn't think it matters anymore. Well, we want to help you explore that. And I always hate to ask people to spend money on a book. I always say you should do everything. You should get everything you can get for free from an author before you spend a dime. So what we're trying to do here is offer a bunch of stuff that's free so you won't feel like it's a big dime to spend. So that's what I hope you'll find at thetruthandtruecrime.com.
That's amazing. Well, when they do buy the book, it's definitely worth the purchase because the ROI is 10 million fold. It just gives you the absolute, like you said, the truth in life and all these principles. So thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show. I can't wait for when you come back again.
I'll be coming back.
You're phenomenal.
Just invite me. I'll be back. Thanks, Annie.
And I hope that this blessed you and encouraged you, reminded you that God gave you a unique light and it is your job to shine it in this world because we need you to. That being said, if you were blessed by this message and you can think of anybody else that also needs this type of encouragement, do me a favor, hit like, hit subscribe, leave me a comment. It helps me out a lot and helps this message that I do believe God gave my heart to share with the world gets out. I hope you have such an amazing rest of your day.